All right, welcome back. Now I'm going to walk you through just a quick little sort of research aside, which is a study you did quite a few years back now, actually. But it was looking at could we potentially leverage Pavlovian conditioning, which, as we talked about, is a much simpler, practically speaking, kind of way or method for training, right? Because you just need two stimuli to appear in a similar period of time. Doesn't require a trained final response or any particular operant response from the dog. Could we sort of combine some of what we were talking about with Pavlovian conditioning with some of what we were talking about with operant conditioning to actually improve detection dog performance using sort of a simplistic or easy-ish training paradigm that basically increases the strength of the relationship between odor and reinforcer delivery. So in some of my sort of early dissertation work, we actually found that Pavlovian conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning in odor can facilitate acquisition of an odor discrimination. So what we did in this situation is before we actually trained the dogs to do an odor detection, we gave the dogs a series of Pavlovian conditioning trials or delayed Pavlovian conditioning trials where the odor would appear and then within 15 seconds of odor appearance, then food would be delivered. And we just repeated this for 5 or 6 trials per session for a couple of days. And then we started training and we found that the dogs that had this earlier Pavlovian conditioning trained or learned to detect that target faster. So a question we had was, can Pavlovian conditioning also maintain stronger responding to an odor? So we talked previously about behavioral momentum theory, right? And that having a higher or richer schedule of reinforcement or sort of building the size of your vehicle, remember going back to your truck, that building up that momentum, that association between that stimulus, in this case, the odor, and the reinforcer, food, or toy, whatever that happens to be, that building this up, could we perhaps maintain stronger responding to odor under different kinds of disruptors? So as we talked about previously, search extinction could be a potentially operational issue. And there's prior work that indicates that higher reinforcement rates lead to better performance. Or basically, if you're reinforcing the dog at a higher frequency of reinforcement, they tend to maintain a higher overall level of performance than at a lower rate of reinforcement. So perhaps we could use Pavlovian conditioning to build sort of greater momentum, if you will, to maintain searching under longer under extinction effects or under different kinds of distracting effects. So what we did is that we trained dogs on 2 different kinds of discriminations, odor detection discriminations. So in one case, root beer was reinforced over lemon, and then they would do a series of trials of this. Then we would switch them to a different discrimination where they'd then do hazelnut versus mint. And here hazelnut responding was reinforced. All of these odors were actually counterbalanced across the study period. But basically the dogs would go through and they'd get 6 trials of this, 6 trials of that, 6 trials of this, 6 trials of that. And it would keep going back so that they were sort of swapping back and forth between these 2 different kinds of discriminations. And what we did is that we picked one of those discriminations and then the dogs got Pavlovian conditioning to that target odor. We did it, but a very simplistic setup. It wasn't automated because we did have a person, but it could be readily automated. The dog was basically just waiting in a particular area, and we had a simple device that would push the odor into where the dog was at, and after the odor was on for 10 seconds, food would be delivered through this little food hopper that would be delivered to the dog, and then the odor would remain on for another 5 seconds. There was a 5-minute intertrial interval, and then this would just repeat every 5 minutes of 15 seconds odor followed by food. We compared this to an unpaired exposure. So basically all the dogs got the same food and they got a similar odor experience, but it just didn't happen during Pavlovian conditioning. So in this case, they got odor and then food in between. So they would have the odor exposure in case that had a potential effect, and they had the food. It just wasn't in this kind of overlapping delayed conditioning paradigm. So all the dogs, we had 12 dogs that were trained on the 2 pairs, and we had one group that had the Pavlovian conditioning, where they had odor pair A, which was Pavlovian conditioned to the target odor. And then they had odor pair B, which was just a control that we didn't do anything with. So they learned that second odor pair, and we didn't give them either Pavlovian conditioning or the unpaired exposure. They just got nothing. So this was just a control to make sure that to compare the performance for the odor Pavlovian conditioning. Then we had the unpaired group that got the odor unpaired conditioning to the target odor and then their control odor. So they did this for 5 sessions. Then our first disruptor is that the dogs were working for food. So we tried to disrupt performance by feeding them immediately prior to this test session. The dogs had 50, 100, and 200% of their entire daily food diet. So say if a dog ate 1 cup of food in the morning or 1 cup of food in the afternoon, the 200% daily food diet would then be 4 cups of food immediately before the testing session. Then the dogs went back to baseline with additional paired and unpaired Pavlovian conditioning. Then we had an odor distractor condition. So in this odor distraction condition, we basically buried food along with the target odor in all of the buckets. So the dogs would have to ignore, food odor if they were going to the correct target odor. And then we had another baseline condition, and then finally extinction. So in the extinction condition, then no matter how many times the dogs responded, they were never being delivered a reinforcer to disrupt the performance and see for which odor would they maintain responding for longer. So what we found in the pre-feed condition for Pavlovian conditioning is that there was perhaps a slight elevation. Overall, the most interesting thing was that even at 200% of their daily diet immediately prior to the test session, so 4 cups of food perhaps for the dog immediately prior to the test session, had almost no impact on performance. Most dogs were still between 90 to 100% even under those conditions. Under the food distraction, that disrupted them a little bit, but they maintained better performance for the odor that had additional Pavlovian conditioning compared to the one that was unexposed. And under extinction, there was a mild elevation, quite minor overall, to the Pavlovian conditioned odor compared to the unexposed odor. And then our unpaired control condition was basically the same, but overall there was no difference between the unpaired conditioned odor and the unexposed odor. So overall, what do these results mean? These results mean that the Pavlovian conditioning are having that extra history of reinforcement between the odor and delivery of reinforcer, completely separate from the training context, just odor, food, odor, food. Some of those pairings did help build the dog that was more robust to some of the disruptions, but overall the effects were relatively minor in this case, but still indicative of the fact that this Pavlovian conditioning within that context did seem to help a little bit, which does again highlight that in addition to the concepts of intermittent schedules of reinforcement and resistance to extinction that we talked about, that you can help also with other types of disruptors by making sure that there's a really strong history of association between that target odor and reinforcers, and that can potentially be done through Pavlovian conditioning even outside of the training context. These results likely could have been a bit stronger if we had a much stronger conditioning history versus a non-conditioning history, because this was only over an 8-day period of time of dogs that were naive to odor detection work prior to the study. So if we're thinking about dogs that are green versus dogs that have had years of detection experience, that might have shown potentially stronger effects. But nonetheless, highlighting the point that the rate of reinforcement to particular odors is also an important consideration, and building that history of a strong level of reinforcement, while considering also that intermittent schedules of reinforcement that we talked about previously are important considerations for designing your detection dog program.